I want to share a really difficult truth with you. We have no idea where the Gospels came from. We really have no idea where the Gospels came from. And I mean, I've heard stories about the origins of the Gospels my whole life, and certain people have shared their ideas as if we just have this like rock solid proof that these Gospels came straight from people who were eyewitnesses of Jesus, and they wrote down what they saw, and the church carefully guarded them and they passed them on to us. But the reality is that's not at all what we see when we look at the evidence, and I'm going to show that to you today. Before we start, my name is Chris. I have a Master of Divinity, a Master of Arts in Theology, and a PhD in Christian Origins. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take a second and subscribe. So here we go, the painful truth. We really don't know where the Gospels came from.
Either God spoke to these men as they wrote by inspiration, or they are the most consistent liars the world has ever known.
And we typically return to eyewitnesses when we ask questions about things that happened in the past. And that's what's so great about Christianity, is it's so dependent upon the eyewitness status.
I think my earliest exposure to an argument that the Gospels were early, reliable eyewitnesses of Jesus probably came in the case for Christ. And I'm going to show you as we go through this a couple of excerpts from the case for Christ, and really just how unreliable the case for Christ is in the way it presents evidence. I'm going to do that as we go because it actually fits really well with the evidence I'm going to show you. But I want to start out with two clips to show you why people are so confused about the origins of the Gospel. Let's start with this one from Daniel Wallace.
The oldest manuscript of the New Testament is now a fragment from Mark's Gospel that is from the 1st century.
Yes, famously in this debate, Daniel Wallace dropped a bomb by claiming that they had recently discovered a 1st century Gospel of Mark. That would be incredible evidence if we have it. But as it turned out, this Gospel of Mark was actually from the 2nd or 3rd century by the time it finally got to light. All of a sudden, everybody went really quiet about it. And not only that, but this Gospel of Mark had been stolen from Oxford University by a papyrologist and sold to American evangelicals.
Oklahoma City-based retail giant Hobby Lobby has filed a federal lawsuit claiming they were sold stolen biblical artifacts.
The artifacts in question sold to Hobby Lobby are ancient papyrus fragments with writings of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, allegedly dating back to the 1st century.
But this is a different story that I'm not telling today. Nevertheless, this so-called 1st century Gospel of Mark was nothing of the sort. Or you might remember this moment from the Wes Huff and Joe Rogan conversation.
We're talking about like what is our oldest manuscript evidence. So this guy is P52. And so there's still debate about the dating of this, but the unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably second century, potentially the beginning of the 2nd century, which means that this is found in Egypt. John is probably writing his gospel in Ephesus. So it has to be written by John, spread around, find its way to Egypt, be copied, and then end up in this manuscript. Wow. Which means that at minimum, you've already pushed the Gospel of John back into the 1st century comfortably.
So here you get this idea that the Gospel of John is really early, really reliable. And spoiler alert, the dating of P52 is really up for debate. It could be anywhere up to a couple centuries, so it could be up to the 3rd century CE. And there are other Gospels that don't look anything like our Gospels that have a really good case for being as old as P52. And I'm going to show you those as we go. So these are the kind of stories that people hear about the origins of the Gospels. And maybe it's not a surprise that people get really invested in the idea that the Gospels are early eyewitness accounts and we know where they came from. But as I'm about to show you, the evidence that we really know where our Gospels came from really isn't all that much of a slam dunk. So let's look at what I consider the strongest evidence that we have no freaking clue where these things came from. So before we get people talking about books that would later be called Gospels, and we do eventually get that, the first glimpses we get of the material that would eventually become what's in our Gospels are primarily through the sayings of Jesus. And some of these sayings of Jesus are really similar to what we get in the Gospels. Very rarely are they identical, but they're obviously really similar. So we do have some traditions that look something like what's in our Gospels that were certainly early. Some sayings of Jesus that the earliest church fathers report are completely different, absolutely completely different. And you know what's wild? What's really wild is that the sayings of Jesus are rarely word for word identical, almost never. And this might fit with how we imagine that people were not really that carefully writing down the sayings of Jesus. They were kind of casually throwing them around, repeating them, sharing them, and the sayings were evolving and changing as they were spread. Let's look at a couple examples. So this one is from the Didache. The Didache is an early instruction manual of the church, and it was even read as scripture often. It uses the phrase gospel several times. It sort of seems to refer to a set of teachings, maybe even oral teachings, and it opens with a quote from Jesus that sort of sounds like the canonical Gospels. Bless those who curse you, and pray for your enemies, and fast for those who persecute you. For what reward is there if you love those who love you? Do not also the Gentiles do the same? But love those who hate you, and you shall not have an enemy. This is a quote from the words of Jesus. The Didache has a pretty good claim to being written alongside of, at some point around the same time as the Gospels. And it has completely different traditions about the words of Jesus. And the Didache also contains sayings of Jesus that we don't get in any existing Gospels. Like this fun one, let your alms sweat in your hands until you know to whom you should give. How about another example? The Epistle of Barnabas, dated anywhere from 70 to 130 CE. It contains several sayings attributed to Jesus. For example, as the Son of God says, let us resist all iniquity and hate it. How about Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, dated anywhere from 110 to 140? It contains several sayings of Jesus that are similar to the Sermon on the Mount material. For example, Polycarp says, remembering what the Lord said when teaching, judge not that ye be not judged. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Be merciful, and you may obtain mercy. So already we have this world where people are quoting the sayings of Jesus almost everywhere we look at the end of the first century and early second century, and almost nowhere do they line up with what we get in our later Gospels. Now, if you want to take a leap of faith and say that the Gospels actually preserved all the accurate sayings and everyone else who was trying to quote them at this time was doing it wrong, I mean, that's a pretty big leap of faith. I think what we actually see is traditions about Jesus evolving and sharing. But what I find really interesting is that we do have the roots of what would be the Gospels, and these are fundamentally the sayings of Jesus. Now, there is one gospel and maybe two that was made up exclusively of the sayings of Jesus. The first one is the Gospel of Thomas. We know about it from fragments at Oxyrhynchus that were found at the turn of the 20th century, and then later a full copy of the Gospel of Thomas was found at Nag Hammadi in the 1940s in Coptic. And this was a sayings collection of Jesus. And the other example, of course, is hypothetical, but we have potentially a sayings gospel behind Matthew and Luke that accounts for the sayings material of Jesus that Matthew and Luke share. This is a hypothetical gospel. I'm still very convinced by the arguments for it, but I won't hang this particular argument on the gospel queue, but that's potentially what we also have behind Matthew. So all that we can see at the earliest stages of these traditions, around the time when hypothetically these gospels are potentially being written, we have people saying the sayings of Jesus, quoting the sayings of Jesus, but almost never do they look exactly like what we get in our gospels. We get a couple that are similar, quite a few that are like familiar but different, and then some that are totally unrecognizable to what we eventually would get in our gospels. But then we come to Justin Martyr, and we see some of the earliest glimpses of evidence that there was something like Gospels floating around. Justin was born in Shechem in Samaria around the year 100 CE, so he was writing kind of around the mid-2nd century. Justin is the first place where we actually get a reference of what he calls the Memoirs of the Apostles. So he talks about what's happening in churches, and he says that people are reading ta apomnemonumata. That's a hard one to say. Apomnemonumata. The memoirs of the apostles is the best way to think about that word. And Justin at another point even clarifies that these memoirs are called gospels, euangelia. This is the word for gospels. So there you go. We have Justin Martyr around the middle of the 2nd century talking about our 4 gospels. But hold on, it's actually a little more problematic than that, because Justin doesn't talk about 4 gospels. Justin has a ton of theology in common with the Gospel of John. He shares a lot of the Logos theology of the Gospel of John, but he doesn't actually seem to know it. He doesn't ever quote the Gospel of John. However, he does quote Matthew, and he even quotes some kind of Lucan or maybe pre-Lucan source. So Justin does quote Gospels. He just doesn't quote the Gospel of John. As far as we can tell, he doesn't quote the Gospel of Mark, but more on that in a minute. He quotes maybe Matthew or something like Luke. And when Justin quotes Gospels, he quotes sayings of Jesus that aren't in our Gospels. So for example, in his dialogue with Trypho, he says, "Our Lord Jesus Christ said, 'In whatsoever things I shall take you, in those I shall judge you.' This is not found anywhere in our Gospels." And Justin famously quotes from different material. He says that there was a fire on the Jordan River at the time of Jesus' baptism, and we certainly don't know of this in any of our four gospel traditions. He seems to share some materials from some source that we don't have in our canon today. So for example, he has a few things in common with the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is probably written around the same time. And for example, one of the traditions is that Jesus was born in a cave. We don't find this in any of our synoptic gospels and the birth stories of Matthew and Luke, but this is something that Justin seems to think, that Jesus was born in a cave. And then there's this really wild thing that Justin could, and I'm going to say could, we don't know for sure, he could reference the Gospel of Peter. So Justin has this thing where he talks about Peter getting his name changed, and Justin says, "And when it is said he changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter, as it is written in the memoirs of him," in his memoirs. Whose memoirs? It sounds like he's talking about the Apostle Peter's memoirs, and we do have a Gospel of Peter circulating at this time. And I have to say, here's a caution, I'll get to it in a minute, that the Gospel of Mark also has a tradition of being the recollections of the Apostle Peter. So it's possible that Justin here is talking about Peter having his name changed in the Gospel of Mark, and we do get this tradition in the Gospel of Mark at Mark 3:17. However, Justin doesn't say the Gospel of Mark, and Justin doesn't really seem to know uniquely Markan material. Justin says that Peter's name was changed as is written in his memoirs, and you can decide, ultimately, I'm not going to hang this whole argument on this, but it could be that Justin is talking about something else, or maybe he's talking about the Gospel of Mark. But in any case, you could spend a lifetime picking apart what Justin knows and doesn't know about the Gospel traditions, but he quotes different Gospels. It's not clear that the memoirs that he's referring to of the apostles are actually our memoirs. He only quotes Matthew and something kind of that looks like Luke. He does not quote John, and as far as we can tell, he doesn't quote Mark either, with that possible exception. And of course, he quotes from different traditions that are not in our Gospels. So this is literally the first time that we have conversations about Gospels, about reading Gospels, about how they were used in worship, and already the person giving us our information doesn't even seem to be using our four Gospels. Okay, so you might ask, and I already hinted at this, what about Papias? Doesn't Papias give us this really nice tradition of where the Gospels came from? I first learned about Papias in The Case for Christ, where Craig Blomberg basically uses Papias to explain why we can trust our four Gospels. But I think Papias isn't doing the work that they wanted to do. Let's read a little bit from The Case for Christ. So this is, if you don't know the story, Lee Strobel, famously, apparently a skeptic, he wasn't really, but apparently was a skeptic, and went to ask some hard-hitting questions about where the Gospels came from. So let's read. "Let's go back to Mark, Matthew, and Luke," I said. "What specific evidence do you have that they are the authors of the Gospels?" Blomberg leaned forward. "Again, the oldest and probably most significant testimony comes from Papias, who, in about AD 125, specifically affirmed that Mark had carefully and accurately recorded Peter's eyewitness observations. In fact, he said Mark made no mistake and did not include any false statement. And Papias said Matthew had preserved the teachings of Jesus as well. Then Irenaeus, writing about AD 180, confirmed the traditional authorship. In fact, here, he said, reaching for a book, he flipped it open and read Irenaeus' words." Okay, so we're going to skip Irenaeus for a minute because Irenaeus is a little bit later, and I do agree, by the time we get to Irenaeus, we do have four Gospels. That's the first place we see it. But let's actually look at what Papias says about where the Gospels came from. So Papias said, "Mark, having become the interpreter of Peter, wrote down accurately whatsoever he remembered. It was not, however, in the exact order that he related the sayings or deeds of Christ, for he neither heard the Lord nor accompanied him. But afterwards, as I said, he accompanied Peter, who accommodated his instructions to the necessity of his hearers, but with no intention of giving a regular narrative of the Lord's sayings. Wherefore Mark made no mistake in thus writing some things as he remembered them. For of one thing he took special care not to admit anything he had heard, and not to put anything fictitious into the statements." So there you go. We do get a tradition that Mark copied down carefully what he got from Peter. But let's read what Papias says about the Gospel of Matthew. Papias says, and this is Eusebius quoting, "Matthew put together the oracles of the Lord in the Hebrew language, and each one interpreted them as best he could." Wait. in the Hebrew language. The Gospel of Matthew was not written in Hebrew. The Gospel of Matthew was written in Greek. In fact, a huge chunk of the Gospel of Matthew is directly copied from the Gospel of Mark and adapted. And even the sayings in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, as I mentioned earlier, could be from a gospel we refer to as the Q gospel, but we don't have any evidence that this was written in Hebrew. And a lot of people have looked for Hebrew roots of Q, but so far we can't actually tell that Q was written in Hebrew. It really looks like it was written in Greek. And there's one more thing that I find really fascinating about Papias. He talks about the story of the woman caught in adultery, which is now in our Gospel of John, between John chapter 7 and John chapter 8. But we know that this was not in the earliest manuscripts of the Gospel of John. And Papias actually says this was from a different gospel. He says this story of the woman caught in adultery is from the gospel to the Hebrews. So again, Papias gives more evidence for the gospel to the Hebrews than Papias gives for the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Luke, or even, I would argue, the Gospel of Matthew. Papias doesn't seem to know about these. And then there's one final piece of evidence, and this is often overlooked, but I actually think it's a really interesting piece of evidence. And that is, we get a bunch of early gospel fragments that are totally different from different gospels, different Jesus traditions. I use that example about what Wes says about P52.
And so there's still debate about the dating of this, but the unanimous consensus is that it's comfortably second century, potentially the beginning of the second century.
And P52 gets thrown around a lot. P52 could be dated the 2nd or the 3rd century. And people throw around the word 125, which is the earliest possible moment P52 could be dated, like it means something. P52 could be dated as late as the 3rd century, which means it can't do the work that people want it to do. But let's look at some of the other early gospels we have. One really recent one that's just come out is P Oxy 5575. It's newly published, and it has a mixture of Jesus sayings that are similar to Thomas and Q, or similar to Thomas and Matthew and Luke if you prefer. It's a mixture of Jesus sayings. It doesn't look like any of our existing gospels exactly, and it could be mid-2nd century to mid-3rd century. Or what about the Egerton Gospel? It contains similar stories to Luke, but all in a style that matches John, and it looks like it was written late 2nd, early 3rd century. Now, there is still some debate ongoing about whether the Egerton Gospel is an example of an earlier gospel that was adapted into the Gospel of John. It may have been a source gospel for the Gospel of John, or maybe it worked the other way. Maybe the Gospel of John took from it. We don't really know. Or how about one of my favorite that I actually did a full breakdown on? You can watch it if you want. It's going to take about an hour. I'm sorry. It is a really, really deep dive on this. But this Lost Gospel, P Oxy 1224, it's a totally unknown gospel tradition. It has some different stories we don't recognize, but it has some sayings of Jesus that are really familiar. And it even matches the Didache in one of its quotations. Now, I should say, you may be looking at the dates on these thinking, oh my gosh, those are so much later than our gospels. But here's the thing. These dates are only the dates of these individual papyri, and each of these gospels has a claim of going back to the earliest teachings of Jesus. In fact, any of these could be older than our canonical gospels. In fact, if we were to stop obsessing over the earliest canonical gospel we can find, like P52, and just look at what the earliest gospels were that people were reading, the earliest fragments of gospel papyri that we have, we would see that there were a lot of different gospels circulating with different words of Jesus and different traditions. By the way, looking exactly like what the church fathers I already mentioned are using, very different traditions of Jesus. So when did we first see our 4 gospels? Well, Craig Blomberg did eventually get around to it. In the case for Christ, around 180, Irenaeus does mention a 4-fold gospel tradition of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But even after this, we get quotes from people, for example, from Clement of Alexandria, who quotes from the Gospel of the Egyptians. So just because Irenaeus says there are 4 gospels doesn't mean that was immediately accepted. I think it took some time for that to filter down, and this was the point that the gospel traditions start to sort of solidify and eventually become the gospels that we know and love today. And after Irenaeus, the church went into overdrive to spread the story that it was always those 4 gospels. Those were the ones that were the most reliable. But when you actually look at the evidence from the earlier church fathers and from the manuscripts I've showed you, we actually get something quite a bit more complicated. We get shifting, evolving stories about Jesus. We get people passing down the sayings of Jesus, never identical, always shifting, always evolving, always being used in different cases. And eventually, this shifting, morphing text comes down to the 2nd and 3rd century where it starts to be stabilized. So what do you have? You have extremely fluid use of the sayings of Jesus in quotes with stuff that we don't recognize, stuff that looks kind of like what we do recognize, but is a little bit different, and very occasionally, very occasionally, something that matches what we have in our canonical Gospels. We have a really heavy focus on the sayings of Jesus, which sort of aligns with the fact that there were probably some early sayings Gospels floating around. We do have different Gospel traditions, like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, or the many unknown Gospel fragments that we have dug out of the sand in Egypt. And finally, we have apocryphal stories about the origins of the Gospels that are interesting, but don't even fit the Gospels that we have. Papias is clearly only talking about our Gospel of Mark, if that's what he's talking about. He's not talking about our Matthew, and he doesn't mention John or Luke. So when people cherry pick this quote from Papias to try to pretend that Papias knows about the 4 Gospels, we do not have the evidence of that. So in the end, a lot of people in the modern world have this emotional idea that the Gospels have to contain the eyewitness sayings of Jesus. The truth is, I think the Gospels probably do contain some sayings of Jesus. I think they're probably edited and adapted and, they get passed on and they get changed. But I do think there are authentic sayings of Jesus in the Gospels, including in the Gospel of Thomas. But the problem is there's no evidence that these came from eyewitnesses. These came from decades of transmission, of evolution, of sharing, and eventually of writing down, and eventually, almost 2 centuries after Jesus, we get the gospel text of 4 gospels starting to be recognized and stabilized. We have no idea where the gospels came from. And the one thing I didn't talk about in this video is the impact of another gospel, famously Marcion's gospel. Marcion, the early church heretic, had a gospel that apparently looked like our Gospel of Luke, that could even have been a source text or could have shared a source text with our Gospel of Luke, and that was in the mid-2nd century. So forget about arguing that the Gospels are eyewitness accounts. That's the least of our problems, because at the end of the day, we don't even know where they came from. I hope this was interesting to you. Please do leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, take a second and subscribe. I talk about ancient Christianity mostly and a little bit about modern Christianity too. There's a link to my website down below. You can join my email list to keep up to date on what's going on with me. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here, and I will see you next time.